The state government had an inquiry into end-of-life choices in 2015, and they came out with 49 recommendations. The first 29 recommendations of that end-of-life choices inquiry was about improving palliative care, and there was some really insightful and valuable lessons developed from that inquiry, and some great suggestions to improve palliative care. The next 18 were about advanced care planning and about how patients could have the opportunity to express their desire for how they be treated, particularly towards the end of their life, so that they weren't subject to burdensome or futile treatments just for the sake of it. And recommendation 49, which was sort of right out of kilter with the whole rest of the report, was the introduction of euthanasia and assisted suicide. Now, the injustice is that recommendation 49, the least merited or argued recommendation of all the 49, has stolen all the oxygen from the rest of the report. And it's clearly distracting everybody because they've devoted all of their time to trying to get up euthanasia and assisted suicide as legal in this state. The report of the Ministerial Advisory Panel is recommending the introduction of euthanasia and assisted suicide, but with 68 safeguards. The reason there are 68 safeguards is that you can't make a lethal process safe. So they figured the more safeguards we have, the more safer people might think it would be. Unfortunately, of course, 68 safeguards means 68 opportunities for the safeguard to be manipulated, or for mistakes to be made, or errors taken, or problems caused. Assisted suicide is where a drug is provided for the express purpose of enabling a person to kill themselves. And if they can't take that drug, then a physician or someone assisting them would constitute euthanasia. Now, there is provision in the recommendations of the Ministerial Advisory Panel for euthanasia in certain circumstances where a person is unable to administer the poisonous dose to themselves. Currently, they're both against the criminal law. They're criminal offences in this state. The Ministerial Advisory Panel, which has somehow morphed into the Ministerial Advocacy Panel because they've gone beyond their brief now of just recommending to the government, and actually they're writing to MPs encouraging them to support the introduction of this law. Their brief was not to say whether it was a good idea or not, or to even research that. Simply, their brief was how to do it in the safest way possible. That was their sole brief. So, the Victorian government is now proposing to decriminalise euthanasia and assisted suicide, but only to a small group. As Professor Owler, the chair of the Ministerial Advisory Panel, points out, only about 140 persons a year would actually qualify for this provision, be eligible for it, if it was introduced. The proponents of this law are generally compassionate people and they're well-intentioned, but they're generally only looking at the surface of things. Many of them are speaking from personal experience, and many of them are actually scarred by that personal experience of observing a loved one whose death they consider to have been lacking in dignity or most distressing or difficult or painful or whatever. Oftentimes without any provision of palliative care, and oftentimes without any appreciation or understanding of the dying process and of palliation and pain management that is conducted. So they argue from emotion, the emotion of that experience they have. And so they tell anecdotes of how a loved one of theirs suffered or appeared to suffer to their view, and or the dying took too long, or it was strung out, or it was unedifying to see someone they respected and loved to be reduced to someone lying in a bed. And so they ascribe indignity to all deaths that might lack decorum. They don't have an appreciation of what death is like because our media and our entertainment industry paint all sorts of different pictures of death. But oftentimes the comments that the proponents will make are seen as insults by people in the disabled community. And I can understand how they would be offended if someone says, if I ever get like that, will you shoot me? Or if I was you, I'd kill myself. How does that resonate with someone who's living with a disability? It's just unbelievable. The proponents are failing to see that every human life has dignity. Their arguments are based on the autonomy of the individual. Not the common good, but my rights, my life, my choice. I want to die on my terms. I have a right to die my way. It's interesting, there is a right to life in the UN Charter of Human Rights, but there's no right to death. There's no specific right to death. But people who like to be in control and like to be in charge really demand being in total control right to the end. And so their arguments will focus on personal choice. And if you are to deny them their personal choice, then that's very cruel of you. They also argue that it's either or. Either you support assisted suicide or you support pain. Either or. Well, that's not really the reality. They agree that palliative care is needed, but then they make their opponents seem disagreeable by arguing that, well, assisted suicide should be part of palliative care if it's needed. All the palliative care people are saying, hey, stay away from us. We are not about that at all. We're about assisting people in their dying, not killing them. So they argue that palliative care won't always work. But then, of course, they think palliative care is only pain management. Palliative care is a lot more than that. Palliative care is journeying with a person. It's sitting and listening and talking. It's about caring for the carers. It's about supporting the carers. It's about foot massages, and it's about bed baths, and it's about all sorts of opportunities to be with a person throughout that dying process. Then they'll try and argue, oh, we already do passive euthanasia. Another made-up term where they say when you refuse burdensome treatment or futile treatment, that's a form of euthanasia. No, it's not. It's quite legitimate to withdraw treatment if it's burdensome or futile. And it's the patient's choice, and they've always had that choice. And part of our problem in our hospitals is we have situations where grandma's lying in bed. The nurse comes in and discovers she's dead, so she calls code blue. And the resus team arrive, and they're jumping up and down, thumping her in the chest, breaking her ribs, and think, hang on, is that dying with dignity? You don't have to resuscitate people if they've died. Not compulsory. Oh, but the family would have expected us to do everything we could. Well, that's where we've got to get better at dealing with death. Then they try and medicalise assisted suicide by putting it onto doctors. And it sounds better if it's done with doctors, and it sounds better if we call it a medical procedure. And then they redefine the terms of the debate, you see, so that they can frame the debate their way. They steal the definition of palliative care, which is assisted dying, and they call assisted suicide assisted dying. And they do it right in that report. They say things like, well, we didn't want to use suicide because it has a rather negative connotation. Well, why? If it really is such a great idea, call it what it is. So, but most of all, be very nice. Be nice and pleasant about it. But when we think more about suicide, suicide's always a tragedy. And in this state, we're spending money on halving Victoria's suicide rate by 2025. And it's just so incongruous that at one stage the government is saying, well, suicide's never the answer. Well, it's never the answer if you're young and good looking. If you're old and your life is, well, then it could be the answer, is basically what the government is saying. They spent $5 million last year on suicide prevention. And this suicide prevention framework is running at the same time as their assisted dying framework, as they call it, voluntary assisted dying. The terms mean absolutely nothing. I mean, there's nothing voluntary about death. It's compulsory. The mortality rate for human beings is 100%. So it's mandatory. But assisted dying is what palliative care is about. This is assisted killing or assisted suicide. And so you get a diversion in the public consciousness, a disconnect. If you're in the disabled community, then you can be given assisted suicide. If you're in the able community, then you'll be assisted not to suicide. Suicide has a social stigma. So in fact, in the report, they say, let's not call it suicide. Let's legislate that a dying person, that is, one who has less than 12 months to live, cannot commit suicide legally. They can't commit suicide. They'll report it to the Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board, but they're not to put suicide on the death certificate. In fact, it says there, the death certificate is not to contain assisted suicide or note assisted suicide. The death certificate is to state the underlying disease which qualified the person to be eligible to utilise this legislation. Governmental doublespeak, but my question is, if it really is good, why do we have to deceive people? Why do we have to lie about these things? There have been 50 attempts to legalise euthanasia or assisted suicide in Australia. One of them has got up in the Northern Territory, and that was later repealed. In Victoria, as I say, we had this end-of-life choices inquiry which found some magnificent research on palliative care, but it's all been ignored because of this government response to the Ministerial Advisory Panel. Now, the legislation was expected in late August. We now understand, because of Fiona Richardson's death and the sensitivities of the state government at the moment, that it won't be introduced into the lower house until the 19th, the week beginning the 19th of September. They were concerned that they didn't want this to be introduced too close to the grievance motions and condolence motions that will accompany Fiona Richardson's death. The Ministerial Advisory Panel says that this is the most conservative assisted suicide legislation in the world. Well, because only 148 people a year would qualify or be eligible for it. But that's not quite true, because in Oregon, euthanasia is not permitted. If you can't take the dose yourself, no one else can do it for you in Oregon. It's only assisted suicide in Oregon, whereas here we also have the option of euthanasia. They say it's conservative because they've combined the requirements of you must be due to die within 12 months together with the unbearable suffering. So they've combined the European models and the American models together. But as I said, Oregon doesn't permit euthanasia. Oregon says you must be likely to die within 6 months, not 12 months. Although they've now introduced a bill to appeal that and to extend it to 12 months, because wherever these things are introduced, there's always an extension that takes place. Now, don't call it a slippery slope. The proponents of these laws don't like the word slippery slope, so never use the word slippery slope. But there is an expansion and extension of eligibility, and it's all based on discrimination. If that person can do it, why can't I? Is the argument that's presented time and again. New Zealand had an inquiry into this same thing. Their chair of their inquiry, Simon O'Connor, said, ultimately, if assisted suicide and euthanasia is a personal choice, as proponents argue, then it's rather hard to put limits on the practice without being discriminatory. As the committee observed with overseas experience, once assisted suicide and euthanasia is enacted, there's a slow but predictable broadening of access. It quickly ceases to be for terminal illnesses and becomes permissible for any form of pain. So, 68 safeguards. As I say, 68 opportunities for things to go wrong. Every procedure has problems or complications. Even taking bloods in hospital has complications. So to say that these 68 safeguards will protect the vulnerable is laughable and naive. The risk of malpractice is there. There's also an additional alibi for murder. Once a person is qualified and received the dose, nothing to stop a family member coming in and delivering the dose themselves to that person. Or, if you want to kill someone, dress it up and present it as a case of assisted suicide. So, these are the difficulties that we're facing. The problems and hassles of the risk of malpractice, the risk of fraud, the risk of mistakes, the risk of just genuine complications. The right to die can easily become the duty to die. I would say, if you want to talk about this with people, ask them to follow the money. Who stands to financially benefit from this law? Governments, health insurers, impatient inheritors. The Oregon model is the one that they've proposed as having no real problems or difficulties, but there were 133 death with dignity deaths in 2016. What we discovered when we look at those 133 people who killed themselves in Oregon is that 80% were over 65, 80% of them had cancer, only 6.8% had ALS, or the the ice bucket challenge, motor neurone, yeah. 96% of them were white, and over 50% of them had a university education. So we're really looking here at an issue for the well-to-do, white and worried. Very few Hispanics, very few African Americans, very few Asians at all. Those communities don't have this problem. If we look at the concerns about why these people did what they did, 91% say losing autonomy. 90% said life's less enjoyable. 77% loss of dignity. 46% said loss of control of bodily functions. 42% said I'm a burden on family, friends or carers. Pain or fear of pain, which is worse than pain because pain can be managed. Fear of pain can't be managed except with palliative care. Was only a quarter of the cases listed as an issue or reason. And yet it's pain that the proponents will argue is the reason why we must have this legislation. Complications. In Oregon, since 1998, we've had 30 people who've had trouble ingesting the dose or have regurgitated. 6 have regained consciousness after taking the dose. The average time is about 3.5 hours from the time of ingestion to the time of death. But we're not quite sure because many of these people died alone with no one around, not even a doctor or caregiver or anyone else. So 543 of the 1,127 cases, we don't know what happened. We know that one case took 104 hours to die. So much for go gently, so much for dying with dignity. So these problems are the complications that are reported on the Oregon website, the government website, state government website in Oregon. That's their statement. And yet our politicians will say, oh, we've looked at Oregon, no problems there. I argue that this is a social, not a medical issue. Migrant communities, people of faith, people who are involved in community activity, they all shun this. It's individualists and people who are socially isolated in their ageing who are finding this a problem. That's why I say it's a social issue, not a medical issue. Pain can always be managed. We can't always eliminate pain completely, but we can manage pain. They'll argue that palliative care is just about pain relief, but we know it's not. It's about companionship, and it's about the journeying, and it's about valuing the person, and about them coming to terms with the dying process and the end of their life. So palliative care, approximately 13,000 people receive palliative care each year. 32,000 people die each year in Victoria, and nearly half of those, 16,000, have a diagnosis that would benefit from palliative care interventions. But you can see there's a shortfall. Demand for palliative care is increasing at the rate of 4.6% per annum. The problem, of course, is we have some of the best palliative care in the world. And for those who are able to enjoy it, that's great. But there's a shortfall, and there are some people, some Victorians, who are not able to access it. So why are our parliamentarians talking about introducing suicide as an answer? Why aren't they focusing on expanding the great work that palliative care already does here in this state? In the hands of a trained palliative care physician, properly administered pain relief can extend rather than shorten a person's life. Dosages that cause death are different to dosages that induce coma or relieve pain. And doctors can tell you that. Properly trained palliative care physicians clearly know the difference between pain relief and causing death. So managing pain, even to the point of palliative sedation, is not killing the patient. The problems in the recommendations is that there's no requirement for mental health evaluation. There's no need to notify the family of these socially isolated people. No ID required to pick up the drugs from the pharmacist, although you have to pick it up in a locked box. Presumably you're given the key to the locked box when you pick it up. It's open to insurance abuse. The effect on medical research is significant. You might have been horrified the other day when you saw the headlines about how they'd eliminated Down syndrome by aborting every child that has it. So how do we get any sort of development of research on motor neurone disease if we kill everyone who's got it? So, just to summarise, the argument they're using is autonomy, but dying is a loss of control, not a loss of dignity. And unfortunately, there's humility and acceptance of the human condition is in short supply here. We need to be prepared to submit to the natural. The breakthrough that they're hoping to bring about is to introduce a legal category that currently does not exist, that has not existed since we abolished the death penalty. By reintroducing that, they can start narrow and then extend. All of the reviews built in this suggestion and in the advisory report are after the event. All of them are self-reporting. So any physician who assists in a suicide has to report that they mucked it up or that they didn't muck it up. They're the ones who fill in the reports. Confusion. Make the test cases so hard and call them safeguards rather than just hurdles or tick boxes. And argue pain, but what you really mean is burden. Distraction. I talked before about the distraction of the first 48 recommendations are getting no oxygen at all. And yet, there's some really valuable stuff there, but it's all lost because of this obsession with killing people. Wherever assisted suicide is practiced, palliative care steps back as a more expensive option. It's much cheaper to kill people. Currently, 40% of needs for palliative care in Australia are unmet. And this, I think, is a classic case of misdirection. Nothing to see here, look over here. But in fact, that's where the real issue is. Finally, euthanasia. That's a term that Dr. Kerin Hitchcock coined to explain how you redefine everything with euphemisms. And you forge death certificates. And you change the terminology. But as we saw from the Oregon experience, it's not a gentle going. Andrew Denton's organisation, which is behind the proposal for this, calls itself Go Gently. But once again, that's misleading and misdirecting. And now's the time to act. Contact MPs and upper house members of the Legislative Council, email them or handwrite letters to them and tell them that this is a deception on the people of Victoria. Visit their office, take doctors or nurses or lawyers or whoever with you when you go to visit them and ask them, if it really is such a good idea, why do we have to deceive people with false names? And why do we have to falsify a public document of the death certificate? And what about the insurance implications? Why does this report say we recommend that assisted suicide should not be triggering suicide exclusions in life insurance policies? Well, they're recommending, but what's an insurance company going to do? There's a suicide exclusion in most life insurance policies. What are they trying to hide? Why are they doing this? Do we really want to legislate a society in which no reasonable person would want to live? One of the things that we've discovered from palliative care and dignity therapy, which is now being practiced as part of palliative care, is the opportunity for people to reflect upon their lives and to share with their loved ones and to say the important things that hadn't been said. That opportunity is there. Now, if you prematurely kill someone, that opportunity is lost. And I think Andrew Bolt spoke about he wasn't at all looking forward to that experience himself, but in fact, looking back on it now, he said some of the most important things in his life were said in those 3 or 4 days before his loved one died. One of the great things about palliative care is that the desire to fulfil the wishes and needs insofar as possible of the dying person, it means that we can bring more people home to die at home and support them at home. Eastern palliative care that I'm fairly involved with in the eastern suburbs, no charge at all. It's free service. And your only charge will be for equipment, like it might be for an oxygen bottle or a special bed or chair or something. But no charge for that procedure or that process or that support. We should be doing this and doing more of it. The deception is being done by really compassionate, as I say, compassionate and well-intentioned people, but the deception of the whole community that's taking place here is a serious cause for concern. Apart from the Nurses and Midwives Association, there's been no doctors group or medical group or pharmacists college or any other group like that who've come out in support of this at all. There have been strong rebuttals from the Catholic health sector who conduct 60% of palliative care in this state. The public hospitals have taken a stance as saying we won't comment. Well, they know where their money's coming from, so they're not going to come out against the government, but they're certainly not coming out in favour of it either. They're just remaining silent. In Belgium and the Netherlands and Switzerland, all of those categories have, the eligibility has expanded, such now that your only requirement is that you be in pain or you perceive to be yourself to be in pain, and life is, you're sick of living or you're intolerable. And there's now even a category in Belgium whereby you're not in pain, but you've done everything you wanted to do, and you're nothing really much to look forward to now, so can we finish it? Yeah, it's sort of fast forward death, you know, skip the boring bits, skip the ads, skip the type of thing. That's basically what's happening in Europe. In Oregon, as I say, there's just a bill being put forward to extend it from 6 months to 12 months. In Canada, there are cases before the Supreme Court arguing that if this category of person can have it, why can't this category, based on anti-discrimination legislation. Now, these things are still in the process and still being heard, but you can see there's Dr. Rodney Syme has said that the legislation that's proposed here is far, far, far too narrow. But Andrew Denton said to him, look, just accept it and we can expand it later. But Rodney Syme said as much in a recent forum. We said, well, I'll keep doing what I'm doing. It's just that I'm not as illegal as I used to be.